The sun hung low and angry over the town of Bitterwine, casting long shadows that trembled in the dust-choked wind. Shutters clapped against warped walls, heat shimmered off rooftops, and boots left shallow prints that disappeared as fast as they were made. Nothing moved, not the dogs under the porch nor the buzzards wheeling overhead. It was the kind of stillness that came after grief and before judgment. The girl stood in the center of the main street, her small frame barely taller than the hitching post beside her. 6 years old, barefoot, freckles dusted across her nose like someone had painted them in the dark. She wore a threadbare dress that had once been blue, now faded to the color of sky just before a storm. Her hands were dirty, her face wasn't. That someone had cleaned, with care, with love, and recently. She clutched something in her left hand, a doll made of rags and twine, missing one button eye. Annabelle Graves saw her from the sheriff's porch where she'd been fixing a shutter. She paused, hammer in hand, the iron badge at her chest catching the last of the afternoon light. It didn't feel right, wearing it, not because she didn't believe in law, but because every time she looked in the mirror she saw her father's face behind her shoulder, disappointed. Or maybe just tired. Either way, she wore the badge like a wound. She squinted down at the girl, waiting for a parent to come running. No one came. The girl looked up, big eyes, dark and unmoving. There was no fear in her, only something that hurt more. Resignation, maybe, or the last ember of hope. She took a step forward and said, "I don't have mama. Can I spend a day with you, ma'am?" Time did something strange then, slowed down, like molasses spilling off a shelf. Annabelle lowered the hammer without realizing it. She stared at the child, trying to find the right response. Something lawful, something safe. But the words the girl had spoken, so small, so quiet, lodged deep in her ribs like a buried thorn. Behind the girl stood a man, broad-shouldered, tan-skinned, and silent. His hat was pulled low, shadowing eyes that had seen more death than a battlefield. His name was Beau Cartwright. Annabelle recognized him, though she hadn't seen him up close in years. He owned a stretch of rocky land outside Bitterwine, land nobody much visited since he'd married that woman from the Willow people. Folks in town had never forgiven him for it, not when he built his own house with tribal carvings in the doorframe, and certainly not when he stopped coming to Sunday service. He stood there now, quiet and unmoving, like a man waiting to be judged but no longer afraid of the verdict. Annabelle stepped down off the porch. The girl kept her eyes locked on her, still holding that frayed little doll like it might be magic. "What's your name?" Annabelle asked. "Millie." "And your daddy?" The girl glanced back. Beau gave a slow nod, his jaw working beneath the beard like he'd chewed on a sentence too long and spat out silence instead. "We buried Mama this morning," Millie said matter-of-fact. "By the pine tree near the big creek." Annabelle blinked. She wanted to say something. "I'm sorry," or, "She's in a better place." But they were lies, and this child didn't look like she'd believe lies. So instead, Annabelle reached out and took her hand. Millie's fingers were cold, even in the heat. Just for a day, Annabelle told herself. One day won't hurt. The town watched. From behind curtains and slats and cracks in the wood, whispers passed like wind, soft, sharp, and mean. By sunset, Annabelle had given Millie a bath, boiled eggs for supper, and let her pick out a flannel shirt from her late father's drawer. It hung on her like a tent. Still, Millie didn't complain. She ate in small bites, legs swinging from the chair. When asked if she missed her mama, she didn't answer, just looked out the window and held the doll to her chest like a secret. Beau hadn't come inside. He waited on the edge of the porch, arms crossed, eyes never leaving the door. He hadn't expected Annabelle to say yes. Hell, he hadn't expected much of anything after lowering his wife into the ground that morning with no preacher and no townfolk, just him, a spade, and a storm of silence. When Millie finished eating, she asked if she could sleep by the stove. Annabelle carried her instead to the cot by her own bed, tucked her in without saying too much. When she stood to leave, a tiny hand reached out and caught her sleeve. "Will you be here when I wake up?" Millie whispered. "I'll be here." Out on the porch, the air was thick and yellowing. The last light clung to rooftops like a desperate man. Beau stood where she'd left him. "You didn't have to," he said finally. "I know. She's all I've got now." Annabelle nodded. "And she's not going back to a cabin with no roof and a grave outside the window." Beau looked at her then, really looked. There was a gratitude in his eyes that shamed her. Like she'd done something holy when all she'd done was follow her gut. She hated that it felt like sin. "I'll come back for her in the morning," he said. "Fine," she replied. "We'll see what the morning wants." He didn't argue, just stepped off the porch and walked into the dark. That night, Annabelle sat in the rocking chair beside the cold stove, badge in her hand, fire dying to coals. She hadn't worn it for weeks before today, not since the shooting out at Split Creek, where a land baron's boy killed 2 drifters and walked free with the preacher's blessing. The law had stood behind the killer because he had bloodlines, and Annabelle hadn't spoken a word in court. She remembered her father's voice. "Don't matter what the law says, matter what you can live with." She couldn't live with a lot lately. Millie stirred once in the night, called out for someone. "Mama, Mum, Ivy," or just a sound too soft to catch. Annabelle knelt beside her and brushed the hair from her cheek until her breathing slowed again. In the morning, the town had changed, not in any real way. Same boards, same buildings, same people pretending they hadn't watched from behind the curtains. But the way they looked at her was different now, like she'd stepped across some line drawn in dust and spit. The preacher met her on the boardwalk outside the general store. His collar was tight, his eyes narrow. "That child staying with you?" She asked to spend a day. "One day's not the problem. The problem's what it looks like to the town." Annabelle didn't blink. "She's 6, and she lost her mother yesterday. You're the sheriff now. That carries responsibility." "I'm aware." He lowered his voice. "You know who her mother was. You know what that means to people." "I know exactly what it means," she said, and walked past him into the store. People didn't speak to her. They moved around her like she was poison. Even Martha Jensen, who once wept in her arms when her boy ran off to Kansas, didn't meet her eyes. Annabelle bought flour, milk, a little honey for Millie's toast, and left without asking for change. By the time she got back to the cabin, Bo was already there. He stood in the same place on the porch, hat in hand. Millie ran to him and hugged his waist. He held her for a long moment, then knelt beside her. "You ready to go?" She looked over her shoulder at Annabelle, said nothing. "Just a little more," she whispered. Annabelle didn't say yes or no, just nodded. Bo looked up, unsure. "I could take her. You don't need this heat." "She does," Annabelle replied, "and I'll take it with her." He studied her, and something settled between them. Not trust exactly, but a kind of shared weariness that resembled it. He didn't press further, just stepped aside. As Millie took Annabelle's hand and led her back inside. That night, it rained. Not a thunderstorm, just the soft, weeping kind of rain that makes the air smell like old promises. Millie drew pictures in Annabelle's ledger book. 3 stick figures, one tall, one medium, one small. She labeled them with shaky letters. Me, Annabelle, Pa. Annabelle let her. When the fire dimmed, Millie turned to her and asked, "Is it still today?" Annabelle thought for a long time. "Yeah, honey, it's still today." Millie nodded, satisfied, and curled beneath the flannel shirt. Outside, Bo watched the rain fall and didn't say a word. In town, the preacher's wife gathered names for a petition. In the shadows behind the saloon, 2 men sharpened blades and planned to teach lessons the law refused. And in the cabin just outside Bitterwine, a girl who'd lost her world fell asleep holding the hand of a woman who'd almost forgotten she had a heart. Tomorrow would come, but tonight, it was still today. The storm didn't come with thunder. It crept in quiet, like grief does, low clouds pressing down on the Bitterwine Valley until even the horses refused to lift their heads. It had been 3 days since Millie first stepped into Annabelle's life. 3 days of shared bread, laughter in moments too short to grab, and silence when the words were too much. But the town's silence wasn't kind. It was thick with judgment, heavy with eyes that saw sin where there was only tenderness. Annabelle felt it first at the post office. The clerk pretended not to see her. The envelope she mailed, an official report about a stolen horse, was handed back unopened with a mumbled excuse. Then came the refusal of credit at the feed store. Then the barkeep who once called her darlin' crossed the street to avoid her altogether. She understood what was happening. Her father had warned her. When a town loses its soul, it looks for someone to blame. Millie didn't notice the cold looks, not at first. She was too busy making drawings in the margins of old town ledgers. Little stories of cabins in flowered fields, stick-figured horses, a smiling Annabelle with a star-shaped badge. Bo carved wooden animals for her in the evenings. Quietly, slowly, the way a man might pray. Each one he handed to her with a gentle nod, as if asking permission to be a father again. Annabel watched them both with a tightness in her chest she couldn't name. It wasn't jealousy, it was something deeper, a longing not to protect or possess, but to belong, to be needed. That kind of love scared her more than any pistol ever pointed at her face. On the fourth day, someone threw a rock through the cabin's front window. It came just after dawn. The sound shattered the stillness, waking Millie with a scream. Bo lunged for the door, gun drawn. Annabel swept the child off the floor and ducked beneath the kitchen table. The roti had a note tied around it with twine. Send her back to the wild where she came from, or we will. Bo crumpled the note in one fist, then threw it into the stove. He didn't say anything, but his shoulders tensed like stone. Annabel didn't speak either. She just sat on the floor, holding Millie as the child buried her face in her neck, breath hitching like the beginning of a storm. Later that morning, the preacher came, not to apologize, not to help, but to make things official. He stood on the porch, hat in hand, flanked by two deputies Annabel didn't recognize, outsiders likely brought in to show strength without history. His tone was measured, cold. The people of Bitterwine have raised concerns about the company you keep, Miss Graves, he said, eyes flicking toward Millie, who clung behind Annabel's skirt. I'm the law here, Annabel said. You were, the preacher replied. Your father kept order with strength and clarity, but you've invited chaos under your roof. Bo stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, not aimed, not threatening, just present. The deputies shifted uneasily. She's a child, Annabel said. She lost her mother. Her father's trying to keep her safe. The preacher's smile was like winter sun, bright and utterly without warmth. The town doesn't see it that way. Half-breeds don't last long in Bitterwine, you know that, and harboring one puts you in direct violation of the moral expectations set upon the badge. Annabel pulled her star from her chest and looked at it for a moment. The metal was worn, edges dulled. It felt heavy in her hand. I enforce the law, she said. The preacher tilted his head. Then start by enforcing the law of God. She didn't respond. Instead, she turned and walked inside. That evening, Bo suggested leaving, not as surrender, but as survival. I can take her up north, he said. I've got kin beyond the Red Hill Pass, folks who don't spit every time they see my daughter smile. Annabel shook her head. You go now, they win. They learn all they have to do is throw a rock and shout a slur. I don't care what they learn, I care that she lives. Millie stood near the stove, hugging the wooden horse Bo carved the night before, her eyes wide and listening, didn't blink. Then she needs more than just life, Annabel whispered. She needs a place where she's not ashamed to love. Bo sat back, rubbing his forehead. And where do you see that place? Because I haven't found it, and I've been looking since before she was born. That night, the rain came. It wasn't loud, just relentless. A slow flood that turned paths to rivers and creeks to roaring chaos. Bo's ranch, set lower than the sheriff's cabin, took the worst of it. The next morning he rode out early to check the damage. When he didn't return by midday, Annabel saddled a horse and left Millie with Martha Jensen, who despite her silence in town had agreed quietly to watch the child. The ranch was half gone. One side of the house collapsed under the weight of soaked earth. The barn doors were torn from hinges. Bo sat by a broken fence post, his face cut, leg twisted unnaturally. She leapt from the horse and ran to him, her fingers searching for blood. I got the photo, he mumbled, pulling a half-ruined frame from inside his coat. His wife smiled out from behind cracked glass. Annabel helped him onto the horse, half carrying him, mud up to her knees. As they rode back, she saw what he meant. Some things were worth holding on to, even if it hurt to do it. But it wasn't just the rain. 2 days later, a fire claimed the abandoned chapel at the edge of town. No one was hurt, but a message was painted on the stone wall in ash and soot. The land will be cleansed. Crow appeared the following evening. No one heard him approach. One moment, the woods were still. The next, he stood beneath the cypress tree out back, a tall man, in a wolf-hide coat with feathers threaded into his braid. His eyes were sharp and unreadable, his hands stained with the colors of bark and blood and old wars. Annabel met him outside. You're Crow, she said. I was. You knew Bo's wife. I buried her mother. His voice was gravel wrapped in wind. She saved my life once. That makes the child mine too. Bo hobbled out with a cane carved from hickory. When he saw Crow, he stopped short. You picked a fine time to remember your family, Bo said. Crow looked him over. You always knew I come late. Annabelle watched them. Two men tied together by grief and stubborn blood. Neither smiled, but something passed between them. Something old, something unspoken. Crow turned to her. They'll come for her soon. You'll have to decide which side you bleed with. I already did, she said. He nodded. Then get ready. The days that followed were quiet. Too quiet. Millie stopped drawing. She carried her doll everywhere now, tighter than before. At night, she slept between Annabelle and Bo, her little body curled like a comma, pausing between two lives. They practiced shooting during the day, not because they wanted to, because they knew it was coming. Crow taught them how to spot footprints in mud, how to hear lies in silence, how to disappear when the world wants your name. Annabelle learned quickly. Bo learned slower, with pain in every step. Millie watched with those big eyes, taking everything in. One night, Millie asked if they were still in today. Annabelle kissed her head. For as long as we can be. They were lighting lanterns when the first shot rang out. It shattered the top window pane. Bo pushed Millie to the ground. Annabelle grabbed her rifle and moved to the doorway. Crow had already vanished into the trees. Two men emerged from the fog, faces masked. One had an axe, the other held a shotgun. Hand over the girl, the man shouted, and maybe you get to walk. Annabelle didn't answer. She aimed and fired. The man with the shotgun screamed and dropped. The one with the axe came running. Bo met him halfway. He tackled him to the ground, shouting in pain as his leg gave out, but holding on. The axe clattered away. They wrestled in the mud until a sharp crack echoed from the tree line. Crow's shot. Clean and final. Silence returned, thick and suffocating. Annabelle knelt by Bo. His hands were shaking, his breath shallow. Still with me? She asked. He coughed and nodded. Crow dragged the bodies away without a word. They buried the attackers behind the cabin the next morning. No ceremony, just dirt and stone. One of them had a wedding ring. Annabelle stared at it for a long time before covering the hand. They were someone's sons, she said. Crow shrugged. So's a rattlesnake. Later, Millie found the badge Annabelle had left on the kitchen table. She brought it to her, eyes questioning. Annabelle took it, held it in her hand, then closed her fingers around it. Not yet, she thought, not while the town still watched from behind its poisoned windows. The wind rose that evening. A storm was coming, but they were ready now. And somewhere out past the trees, a place waited. A place where love didn't have to whisper. Where a child could wake up and know the day hadn't ended yet. Dawn was a rust-colored wound across the sky, bleeding orange and gold onto the rooftops of Bitterwine. The storm had passed, but it hadn't left peace in its wake. It had scoured the land, shifted fences, snapped branches, exposed the brittle roots of everything buried, truths, grudges, and the last defenses people kept around their hearts. Inside the sheriff's cabin, Annabelle stood before the mirror, the badge in her hand once again. It no longer felt like a shield, it felt like a question. Behind her, Bo sat at the table, leg bound tight, eyes steady despite the pain in his bones. He was bruised, worn, but unbroken. Millie curled beside the stove, drawing in the soot on the floor with her finger, sketching lines that looked like roads and suns and horses riding towards somewhere free. Annabelle pinned the badge to her chest for the last time. She wasn't putting it on to protect the town, she was putting it on to face it. They didn't knock. They never did anymore. The preacher came with two men in gray coats and city boots, lawmen summoned from afar, summoned by lies and whispers dressed as scripture. They stood in the dust outside the door, waiting like crows waiting for something to die. Annabelle opened the door and stepped onto the porch. "Mornin', Miss Graves," the preacher said, voice calm, eyes hard. "I believe you know why we're here." She nodded once. "To finish what cowards started." The taller of the outsiders stepped forward, hand on his belt where his revolver sat gleaming. "We've been asked to remove you from office, voluntarily if possible." "And if not?" Bo asked, stepping into view behind her. His cane thudded once on the floorboards. "Then we do it by force," the man replied. Millie appeared between them, holding Annabelle's hand without a word. Her small fingers trembled. She was trying to be brave, and it nearly broke Annabelle's heart. Annabelle reached into her pocket, pulled the badge off, and held it up. It glinted once in the rising sun before she laid it gently on the wooden table beside the door. "Then there's nothing to remove," she said. The preacher's mouth twitched. He hadn't expected surrender, not this way, not this calm. "But understand this," she added. "You may claim that badge, but you'll never wear what it stood for. My father carried it to serve justice, not fear." The lawmen said nothing. They waited, watched. Perhaps they expected a fight, perhaps they wanted one, but Annabelle only turned, lifted Millie into her arms and walked back inside. They packed in silence, a saddlebag for each, a small wooden box for Millie's carvings, the drawing book, a tin of biscuits. Crow appeared just before noon, mounted on a paint horse, eyes scanning the horizon. He didn't speak as they loaded the wagon. He didn't have to. His presence alone meant the road ahead would be watched and guarded. Bo tied the last strap and glanced at Annabelle. "You sure?" he asked. She looked over her shoulder. Once, at the town. At the crooked steeple. At the broken window of the general store. At the place where her father had once stood tall. "Yeah," she said. "They already buried everything good here." They rode out slow. Not in haste, not in fear. Just with the quiet dignity of people who had lost enough. The townsfolk gathered silently along the edge of the street, on porches, behind fences, beside wagons they'd once offered to share. No one spoke. Some looked away. A few children waved. Their parents pulled their hands down. Halfway down the street, the mayor stepped out from the barbers and called, "You'll find nothing but dirt out there." Annabelle pulled the reins, turned to face him. "That's all we found here too," she said. And then they rode on, past the last homestead, past the bent fence posts, past the old pine where Millie's mother lay beneath the earth, now marked by a circle of white stones and wildflowers that hadn't been there the day before. Millie saw them and pointed. "Did you do that?" she asked. Crow shook his head. "No, nature did. She don't take sides." They camped that night near the river bend where the trees whispered and the stars came out like 1,000 small voices singing in the dark. Bo built the fire. Annabelle cooked beans and cornbread. Millie curled up in her bedroll beside them and fell asleep before the meal was done, hand curled tight around the wooden wolf Crow had carved her the night before. Crow sat across the fire, sharpening a blade slowly. "You're quiet tonight," Annabelle said. He didn't look up. "Because the story isn't over yet." She frowned. "You think they'll come after us?" "No," he said. "But the world don't stop judging just because you rode out of one town. You'll see more bitter wines, different names, same poison." Bo nodded. "Then we keep riding." "And when Millie's old enough to ask why she couldn't stay?" Annabelle glanced at the girl, peaceful in sleep. "Then we tell her the truth," she said. "That we chose her over everything else." The fire cracked. Wind rustled the branches. Somewhere, a coyote called out, lonely and wild. They moved north for weeks, through desert and forest, across rivers and over ridges. They avoided towns when they could, traded only when they must. Crow taught them to find edible roots, how to track deer by hoofprints, how to spot poison ivy before it itched the skin off your hands. Millie learned too, eyes wide, asking questions about birds, about trees, about why the sun felt hotter some days than others. She never asked about bitter wine, not once. They built a cabin in a glade nestled between two hills, where water ran clean and the wind carried no sermons. It was rough at first, chopping wood, hunting meat, fixing leaks when storms came, but it was honest, and no one watched them from behind curtains anymore. Crow stayed nearby, visiting when he wanted, disappearing when he didn't. Bo's leg healed slowly, but he smiled more. He laughed now. Annabelle caught herself humming as she stirred the pot some nights. Millie grew taller, louder, stronger. She ran barefoot in the grass, face lifted to the sun, arms out like wings. One evening years later, Millie asked, "What happened to the badge?" Annabelle took her to the river and knelt beside the smooth stones. She pulled from her satchel a small box wrapped in leather. Inside lay the badge, dull with time. "I thought you threw it away," Millie said. "I thought about it," Annabelle replied, "but part of me still believes in what it was supposed to mean." Millie reached out and touched it gently. "Did you miss it?" she asked. "No," Annabelle said. "I missed being someone who thought it could fix everything." Millie nodded, wise beyond her years. "I like you better now, The girl stood and ran ahead, skipping across the rocks like the river couldn't catch her. Annabelle stayed by the water a while longer, listening. The badge glinted once, then faded into shadow as the sun slipped behind the hills. That night, they sat by the fire again. Millie braided flowers into her hair. Bo played a slow tune on a carved wooden flute. Crow sat with eyes half closed, breathing the smoke like it carried old memories. Annabelle leaned back and watched them. She thought of all they had lost, of the names unspoken, the doors slammed, the hands not held, but none of that weighed more than what they had now. The cost had been high, but the reward, it was everything. In the distance, lightning danced across the ridge, silent and far. Millie looked up. Storm coming? No, Bo said. That one's just showing off. They laughed. A family, not bound by law or blood or the approval of those who built fences around their hearts, just bound by choice, every day choosing each other, even when it was hard, especially then. Annabelle reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a letter she had never sent. She unfolded it and read it silently. It had no address, just words. To whoever finds this, we didn't run, we left. There's a difference. She folded it again, kissed it once, and dropped it into the fire. The flames took it slow, curling the edges like old parchment, swallowing the words with grace. The sky opened above them, wide and dark and full of stars. And the three of them sat there, untouched by judgment, untouched by law, breathing in a freedom bigger than any town could offer. The day Millie begged for had never ended. It had just grown into a life. She only asked for a day. They gave her a new life. If this story gripped your heart, don't leave just yet. Like the video if you felt even a flicker of hope in their journey. Comment below. What would you have done if you were that rancher? Subscribe for more hauntingly emotional Western tales where justice ain't always written in law books. New cinematic stories every week of loss, found family, and the quiet strength to love again. Stay until the end, because out here, every goodbye might be the beginning.